Hello, and welcome to another virtual program with the Paul Sawyer Public Library. My name is Diane Dehoney. I'm the Community Service Librarian for Paul Sawyer, and it is so wonderful to have all of you joining us tonight. So glad to see everyone. This is a very special program tonight. As many of you may know, not this Saturday, but next Saturday, which will be the 21st, we're finally getting to have our Kentucky women's suffrage Centennial celebration. It was scheduled for last year, and with the pandemic, that wasn't able to happen. So it's been rescheduled, and all of that will be taking place. They have a whole day full of events going on the 21st. And if I see any of the folks who are on that committee come in on the, some of them were registered for this program. If I see any of them come in, I may have them say a few words about that at the close of our presentation, just to give you a little bit more detail on that. But the library wanted to host something sort of in tandem with that celebration, and I thought, what could be better than getting the author of this wonderful book that came out recently about women's suffrage, and specifically Kentucky women in the suffrage movement. So we were so glad tonight to welcome Melanie Biels-Gom. She is a professor of history at the University of Kentucky. She's originally from Erie, Pennsylvania, but has lived in Kentucky since 1994. She earned a BA in history from Slippery Rock University and an MA and PhD from the University of Kentucky. Her research interests include, and also her teaching focus include 20th century U.S. history, Kentucky history, gender, and the history of healthcare. She also published a book called Mary Breckenridge, The Frontier Nursing Service and Rural Health in Appalachia in 2008. But tonight she's going to be talking about her 2020 release from the University Press of Kentucky, A Simple Justice, Kentucky Women Fight for the Vote. We're so pleased to have you tonight, Dr. Goan. And I would ask before she begins, just in deference to our speaker, that you would mute yourself. And then if you have questions at the end, do feel free to unmute yourself and ask your questions. Or if you're bashful, you can put them in the chat and we'll make sure that your questions get answered. So without further ado, welcome, Dr. Goan.
Well, thank you, Diane, and good to see everyone. Thank you for being part of this tonight. I see some old friends and some new friends here that I get to meet. So I'm excited to join you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Give me just a second. So we have some visuals to go with things. And I want to start here with Susan and Elizabeth, and I have a feeling you know this Susan and Elizabeth. We're going to talk about them here in a moment. As Diane said, 2020 was a big year. Now we're celebrating 101 years of women voting. It was supposed to be the big party last year. We were going to do it up big. We were going to have parades and marches and memorials and merriment, and then it went something like that. We can't exactly blame the patriarchy, I guess, although it feels like we got cheated, and this isn't all, it looks like a very heavily woman crowd, so I guess I can make that joke. Quarantine stopped a lot of the fun, but one thing it didn't stop was the production of new suffrage scholarship, and a lot of new books came out last year. If you get a chance to pick up some of these titles, your local library would be a great place to do that. Maybe you all have copies of these on hand, but a real wave of new scholarship, new interpretations of this important movement, and my book was one of those. And there you can see the cover. It's the big question in this book is, what role did Kentucky women play in the suffrage movement? Why does Kentucky matter in this story? And Kentucky matters more than you might expect. And hopefully you'll see that tonight. Kentucky is very important in this struggle. Now, let me say something before we begin about the title. And titles are always really hard. As an author, I've done this twice now, and both times that's been one of the most difficult parts of writing a book. Coming up with a title, the press wants it to reflect certain things. They're worried about marketability, just a lot riding on the title that gets selected. And so this one I really like. It was a compromise between me and the press, but I think it really is a good one for this book. A Simple Justice. This is something that suffragists said about the vote for women. It was something they deserved. It was something that was long overdue. A simple justice, taking them out of the category of children and lunatics, as they were known at the time, people that couldn't be trusted with the vote, women demanding here to be treated as equals, and this simple justice that they win. But I also like this title because it also highlights some of the blind spots in the suffrage movement. And we could actually, I think, put a question mark behind these words. Suffragists, while they said the vote was a simple justice, sometimes it didn't seem like they really believed that, at least not a justice that should be extended to everyone. They balked at the idea of, in some cases, immigrants voting, the illiterate, and certainly race here, a complication in the suffrage movement, race and gender intersecting in critical ways. And Kentucky really helps to reveal some of these intersections between race and gender. And there's a good reason it took over 7 decades for women to win the vote. If it had been so simple, it probably would have happened much earlier. Now, most people, if I ask them about suffrage, I say, tell me what you know. There is almost a textbook answer that I get to that question. The standard story goes something like this, and this is how my husband related it to me. And I consider him a very intelligent guy. He has a PhD, but what he knew about suffrage before I wrote this book was very, very limited. So maybe this is what your knowledge looks like. Most people say the suffrage movement started in Seneca Falls, and I see people shaking their head, 1848. Women decide they need the vote. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, those are the 2 people that come to mind readily for us when you say suffragists. Then maybe you think about parades, women marching, because you had to convince all those men out there who were worried that if women left their children long enough to vote, the whole world would crash in. You had to convince them. So we've got these parades going on. My husband, he recalled, well, I think some women protested at the White House. Yes, that's true. They picketed there. And then poof, we think of the 19th Amendment, 1920, when suddenly all women across the country could vote. We like tidy narratives. History, we do this a lot. We do it in Kentucky history. If you say Kentucky history, Daniel Boone comes to mind. If you say civil rights, people think of Rosa Parks, they think of Martin Luther King. We like to boil things down into neat, tidy narratives. But the real story is much more complicated. Studying history has taught me there is always a backstory. And then that backstory probably has dozens of other backstories. And that's where you get into the really interesting details. So the real story, much more complicated, than we imagine, filled with victories and setbacks. Over 7 decades, you can imagine how the end might appear in sight, only to slip away again. Many women are going to be enfranchised with the ratification of the 19th Amendment, but not all women. And that's really important clarification here, and something that scholars in this last year, when we've been talking about women voting, have really emphasized. The fact that this was not maybe the magic moment we like to think it to be. Now, one reason for this is there are plenty of women who are voting long before 1920. 1920 for them brings no change. They were voting, maybe their grandmothers were voting before that. Western women were some of the first to have the ballot. And so you can see here, Wyoming, for instance, 1869, you have women voting decades before 1920. That's why when I point out, I mention Jeanette Rankin often in my US history classes. She is a member of the House of Representatives in Washington. She's one of the people that vote against World War I. And students are always, you can see them sort of processing this and scratching their heads. Wait a minute, she's voting against this in 1918, or excuse me, 1917. How could that be? Women can't even vote. Well, they could serve in the legislature from Montana here, Jeanette Rankin going to Congress. So you have some women that are voting long before 1920. And then many who still won't vote after that important milestone. You can see here, 1940, if you looked across the across the South, only 3% of Southern African Americans who were old enough to vote were registered to do so. That's in 1940. So this is going to be a long, drawn out process of women claiming their rights, even once the Constitution says that they have this right to vote. Now, the story also complicated a bit when we remember that not all women agree on the issue that they should indeed vote. Many women are going to line up as anti-suffragists, and we have to be aware of that. But even those that do think that women should have this right, there's a lot of disagreement among these women. Tactics, the way that the vote should be achieved. So this disagreement is an important factor as well. And I want to stress here the terminology, and these are words we often hear interchange: suffragists and suffragettes. And I see all the time, newspapers will refer to suffragettes. That word actually is, in the American context, being used inaccurately. Women at the time, women who endorsed the vote, they called themselves suffragists. And certainly here in Kentucky, they absolutely rebelled against being called suffragettes. Suffragettes comes from the British movement. It refers to a more radical approach to gaining the right to vote. Suffragettes were willing to throw rocks through windows and burn down buildings if necessary. And suffragists really adamantly stressed that kind of action was something that they wanted no part of. And certainly here in Kentucky, where you have a more, I'd say, conservative suffrage movement, they do not want to be called suffragettes. So what is Kentucky's role in this movement? We have our own suffrage story, a very important story. Now I'm this little quiz here, you can put it in the chat or you can unmute yourself. I guess I haven't been in the classroom all summer and I feel the need to test someone. So I want, if you know any Kentucky suffragists, the names of the women here in this movement in our own state, go ahead and share those with us. Who do you know that was a Kentucky suffragist? Anyone brave enough? Kate, do you know any?
Laura Clay.
Laura Clay, yes. How many people have heard of Laura Clay? Do we have some hands? Yeah, okay. Laura Clay is a great one. Let me see what's going in chat. Madeline Breckenridge, that's the other one I expected probably someone would come up with. Madeline McDowell Breckinridge, of course. Mary Barclay. Mary Barclay was Laura Clay's older sister, and she was actually much more involved in the suffrage movement earlier than her sister. So she deserves mention here as well. But you got the two big ones there. We could say Madeline McDowell Breckinridge and Laura Clay. That's our Susan and Elizabeth here in Kentucky. And so I'll start by telling you just a little bit about them, since they are so well known. There you've got Laura Clay. She looms the largest over Kentucky's movement. One of the Clay girls, younger sister of Mary Barclay. One thing that set Laura apart from her sisters, and there were 4 Clay girls, sisters plus their mother, who was also involved in pushing for the vote. Laura never married. So for her, the suffrage movement becomes her career. It is her main focus in life. Her sisters, they had children, they have other things that are really diverting some of their attention, harder to balance that, those competing roles. So Laura Clay really takes and shoulders this movement in Kentucky. She's not the granddaughter or great-granddaughter of Henry Clay, in case you might have thought the name there is connected. She's actually Cassius Clay's daughter. And if you know anything about Cassius Clay, the notorious Cassius Clay, and the way he treated the women in his life, it's no wonder that they go on to be suffragists. Laura Clay is going to help establish the Kentucky Equal Rights Association, and she's going to lead the state organization from 1888 to 1912. So almost 3 decades. She's the most recognizable suffragist. But Madeline McDowell Breckenridge here, absolutely deserving a lot of the credit, especially for Kentucky's role in the 19th Amendment. She is the great-granddaughter of Henry Clay, so she has those ties. Name recognition, she's married to a newspaper editor. That's going to help her get the message out about suffrage. She is the consummate progressive reformer. She had her finger in every reform cause in Kentucky during the first decades of the 20th century. And she's going to lead Kentucky's suffrage movement across the finish line. So these are the two we most remember, but thousands of others, especially by the 19-teens, thousands of men and women across the state are supporting suffrage and women's right to vote. You can see here the way this movement grows over time. And, you know, in the first years of the 20th century, they hover around 300 members of the Kentucky Equal Rights Association. By the 19-teens, that's approaching 20,000 members. So this becomes a more mainstream cause over time. So the Kentucky Equal Rights Association, the state organization, we see that founded in 1888. Members, chapters, they called them locals. Locals formed in communities across Kentucky. Lexington, Richmond, Northern Kentucky, those were some of the first locals and the most active. Louisville lags behind. You don't see Louisville really grow any real momentum there until the 19-teens. Frankfort's local formed in 1902, in case you were curious. but it grows really slowly also. In 1907, there was only one dues-paying member from Frankfurt. It had withered to almost nothing. But the 19-teens, it sees its growth begin. And I think it's 1916, they have about 250 members in the Frankfurt local. Kentucky's chapter, Kentucky's state organization, the first of its kind in the South. So it's unique in that way. Not so much concerned with the vote necessarily early on. This Kentucky Equal Rights Association, and notice the name is expansive of other reforms they're trying to accomplish. So for instance, a Woman's Property Act, so you could keep your wages, or if your father, if you had an inheritance, your husband couldn't spend it away. Age of consent laws, this was a really big deal for women who are organizing for the vote. At first, the age of consent law in Kentucky, we have one, but the age of consent is 12, and women were horrified by this. They said, you can't consent at age 12. So they worked to increase that. They're also trying to open colleges up to women, all kinds of efforts here underway. And the vote increasingly becomes a way to achieve those other things. Now, here's a woman you may not, no one mentioned Josephine Henry's, but I want to put her in the spotlight here for a minute. Her efforts, absolutely essential in getting some of these key reforms that we take for granted today, that we benefit from, the Property Act that I mentioned a moment ago. Josephine Henry should be as recognizable to us as Laura Clay. This Property Act that she is pushing for, she's going to Frankfurt every time the legislature's in session. Women are there lobbying lawmakers, and Josephine Henry, the most eloquent of them all. She told shocking stories of women in her own community. She's from Versailles. One woman, for instance, had been stripped of her assets, and this is how Henry describes it. She said, a man sold a cow that his wife had bought with money that it took her 3 months to earn with her needle. So she made this money. The only concession the poor woman got was they allowed her to milk the cow before they drove it away. Worse, Henry points out, the greedy husband traded the cow for a gun, and then filled up with whiskey and went on the warpath. So these misbehaving men, Josephine Henry makes it her mission to hold them accountable. And she is quite a spitfire, I'll tell you what. She is the first woman in Kentucky to run for statewide office. She runs for clerk of Kentucky's Court of Appeals in 1890. She chose this position because it paid the best. Hey, might as well go for broke, she figured. She also is mentioned later as a candidate for President of the United States, 1900. She's running under the Prohibition Party ticket. Now, she likes to push the envelope. She's a bit avant-garde. She gets hooked up with Elizabeth Cady Stanton's Woman's Bible project, where they're rewriting scripture to reflect women having a greater role. She also declares herself an atheist. She says things like Thanksgiving should be abolished. She has some crazy ideas, and she gets pushed out of the suffrage movement. Her ouster is going to set the Kentucky Equal Rights Association on a more conservative path, which made Laura Clay very happy. There you can see her nomination for President of the United States. Oh, yeah, and there I point to, she thinks Thanksgiving Day should be abolished. References to God removed from the Constitution. Some of this doesn't go over so well in 1900. So Clay wants the Kentucky Equal Rights Association to be as ladylike as possible, a pretty conservative approach. the ideas of Josephine Henry, they don't play well in the Bible Belt or the South generally, where you see more conservative values. And so Clay wants to keep suffrage above the fray, to divorce it from other radical issues. She always begins CARA meetings with a prayer and quotes scripture. They sang hymns. It almost looked like a revival meeting to go to a suffrage meeting at this time. Laura Clay, she doesn't want to work with labor unions. That was a little distasteful for her. When parades become a big thing, she has her doubts about that. That's not ladylike. So Laura Clay, pretty conventional. But most important to Laura Clay is she wants to keep suffrage and race separate issues. She wants to make sure that women, if they get the vote, it doesn't open up the issue of Black women voting. And you can see here a pamphlet, which I'm pretty sure Laura Clay authored. She made this argument frequently, over and over, to audiences that giving women the right to vote was a solution to the race problem. It would protect white supremacy. And people have asked me that before, using those words, race supremacy. She's very blunt about it. That, she says it like it is. This is a way to keep whites in power, and uses those exact words, white supremacy. So you can see here this little passage where she's talking about adding up the numbers of white women. If they get the vote, they're going to offset the number of Black women. And so this makes good sense. She builds CARA into an all-white organization. And segregation is becoming more entrenched in this period, but it is a little ironic that Laura Clay comes from an anti-slavery family. Her father was an abolitionist, or at least an emancipationist, wants to see slavery come to an end, but you wouldn't guess it based on the arguments Laura Clay is making about women's potential to counteract the Black vote. There's going to be a few really small efforts in CARA's history to recruit Black women to the cause, never endorsed by Laura Clay. Other women played around with this idea, but all those efforts ended very quickly, and no separate Black suffrage organization is going to exist in Kentucky. Now, this does not mean Black women were not suffragists. And we have really important examples like Mary Ellen Britton of women who are actively endorsing suffrage. In fact, Mary Ellen Britton is giving the first suffrage speech in the state of Kentucky in 1887 at a meeting of teachers in Danville. Mary Ellen Britton, she was a graduate of Berea College. She was a teacher first, then goes to med school, a dedicated race woman. That's how she was often described. Now, Black women, in my book, I really investigated this. I was looking for evidence of Black women organizing to push for the vote, and I don't find it. And others have argued similarly that Black women just don't have the luxury of putting their attention on one issue like that. They have other bigger priorities. They're fighting to end lynching. They're pushing back against segregation on the trains and a host of other problems. Those are the more pressing issues for them. But as this picture here reveals, and this is one of my favorite images that I included in the book. These are women registering to vote in the summer of 1920 in Louisville. And Black women do eagerly go to the polls. So it's not that Black women don't support the right to vote. They're not encouraged to join the Kentucky movement, and their activism is really focused in other directions. So Kentucky, really important. I said suffrage was a tough sell in the South because of the race problem, because of more conservative religious values, but that was why Kentucky was so critical. National leaders look at Kentucky as the gateway to the South. Kentucky was the path. If you were going to make inroads, if you were going to win over Southern suffragists, you had to have Southerners on board who were leading them in that direction. And Kentucky women, the Clay women especially, with the name recognition they have, national figures saw them as their ticket to the South. Also, Kentucky, in their minds, was a place with great potential because Kentucky, believe it or not, was one of the very first places in the United States to enfranchise women. And here's another little quiz. I'm going to ask you to take a guess. 1838, so long before most women are voting, a few women in Kentucky are able to cast ballots. Someone tell me, what do you think? What kind of election are they able to vote in? Someone want to put that in chat or?
Yeah, it's a school election.
Elections. Yeah, you got it right. School boards. Yep. I mean, women are teachers, they're mothers, schools seen as appropriately feminine, and Kentucky women getting this right in 1838. So national leaders looked at that and said, hey, you know, these progressive Kentuckians, they've given women the ballot before. Now, we take it back, we don't keep it this sort of a right that is extended and then pulled back. But national leaders see that as an indication that Kentuckians can be swayed to embrace expanded rights for women. So national leaders, in fact, call Kentucky, they describe it as one little star of light in their publicity, and as they're thinking about expanding the movement, Kentucky seems to be the pathway forward. And Laura Clay is going to become a nationally renowned leader, and not just here in Kentucky, but across the country. She goes to states to help lead their efforts. And here you see, I love this. This is from her scrapbook at the University of Kentucky. You can go and flip through it and see pictures like this. Laura Clay there in the back row with all these figures that you may have heard of. If you know beyond Aunt Susan, she's in there. Mrs. Catt, Carrie Chapman Catt is in there, and Miss Gordon. You've got all these figures that are important in the national movement, and Laura Clay, a colleague of them, and a holding national office for many years, which makes what happens, and my book chronicles this is part of the drama of the book. Laura Clay is going to break ties with this movement, both on the state level, on the national level. She becomes this really controversial figure. She wants woman suffrage, there's no doubt about that, but she feels like it has to happen in one way and one way alone, and that's by states granting this right, rewriting their own state constitutions. And partly this is because she believes the South will never go for an amendment, a federal amendment. They'll block its passage and its ratification. But she's friends with a lot of Southerners, and she, I think, shares their belief and their support for white supremacy. And so better to keep things within the powers of the states, she argues. But national leaders by 1916 are going in a different direction. They say they believe that the federal amendment is the right way to gain the ballot. Laura Clay adamantly opposes. She withdraws her membership from CARA. She forms a rival suffrage organization. And it was shocking to people that this woman whose name was synonymous with suffrage here, when the end was in sight, should leave and reject this movement. So my book, when it starts, Laura Clay is going to Tennessee. Tennessee, the last state needed to ratify in August 1920. Laura Clay goes not to help see it passed, but to join up with anti-suffragists to see it go down in defeat. But much to Clay's chagrin, Kentucky will be one of the states that ratifies the federal amendment. It did so January 1920. There's Governor Morrow signing as these women look very carefully breathing down his neck, it looks like to me, watching him sign that. This was largely due to Louisville women, their efforts to get this ratified, and Madeline Mcdowell Breckenridge. Kentucky will be one of only 4 Southern states to ratify. The vote was an important victory, but the story of how it was won doesn't always reflect our best selves. We certainly see that in Clay's actions. It was in no way simple, and in many ways a continued betrayal of justice. Many people have worked this past year to not only celebrate suffrage, but to interrogate its blind spots. I prefer to use the word commemorate. We have commemorated, marked this occasion. But racism, class division, self-interest, they were part of the story. And I guess we would suspect nothing less because it is a human story. But it is a story that's filled with important lessons for today as we look at voting rights and some of the erosion of voting rights that's going on right now. It reminds us how very important this story is. So I'll stop sharing, and I'm happy to take questions if you have any, or comments, just things we want to talk about.
So Melanie, was there anyone in Frankfurt? Was there any Frankfurt suffragists that were notable?
Yeah, Christine Bradley South is probably the best known. Governor Bradley's daughter, and she becomes the president of the Kentucky Equal Rights Association for a time. Madeline Mcdowell Breckenridge holds that position several times, and in between, Christine Bradley South is leading the state organization. You have some other women. I should pull up the list so I can remind myself. The Averill women, that name shows up a lot.
That's Nash's relative. Nash Cox here. That's her
Oh
relative.
yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, look at that.
Yeah.
You don't have any good memorabilia, do you?
Do you have anything, Nash? Nash, unmute yourself.
I have nothing. In fact, it's only fairly recently that I've been more aware of the history, and it's been fascinating to learn more about.
Yeah. Well, you come from a good line of women there, because the Averill name, they're sort of I think the backbone of those very earliest years.
Yeah, I was asking, well, the Brown women, we just recently found out that 2 of them were involved. I'm at Liberty Hall. And so they were involved really early, 1902, something like that. But they lived around the corner from where Nash's relative lived. And But yeah, so I think like maybe they, but you said by 1907 there was only one.
Yeah, yeah. I'm
So I
not
don't know what
sure who
happened.
the one was, but
Yeah, I
one
don't know.
paying member is all.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
know. Well, I was looking into a little in 1905, I think there was like 5. So yeah, it was really small, but yeah. So anyway, I was just wondering because of that.
Well, as people described it, you had to have really thick skin to be a suffragist, and your
Okay.
family did too. I mean, before 1912, 1913, it's pretty controversial. And so I can see where a lot of women would shy away from it. And often when you do see women who are getting involved, they're coming in packs, like family members, sisters, aunts, people that they're close to, sort of, I think, safety in numbers.
Okay.
But while we're talking about the Averils, I know they were very, very important to the founding of the library. So,
And
I
we
have to put a plug in since this is a library program.
That's good. Yeah. Hallie Herndon is another name that I remember coming across, and she was the one who invited Laura Clay to come and give a suffrage talk, and that sort of got the ball rolling. There was one other name though I was going to look up. Miss Elizabeth Pepper.
Yes.
Oh yeah, that's a name
Bessie
around here.
Pepper.
Yeah.
Yeah, and she was also involved in the bourbon industry, from what I have heard, and a businesswoman. So in writing the book, I mean, I had thousands of people that I could have investigated further. That's one name, though. That's someone I want to go back to and see what I can find out, because it seems like that's a pretty fascinating story there.
Many of these people that you mentioned all live within a block of each other.
Yeah.
Christine Bradley South, lives right on Wapping Street, and Elizabeth Pepper lived on Main Street.
Okay.
Plus, then the Brown family were right on Wilkinson, and the Averils were on Washington. So it was one block,
Yeah.
basically.
Well, and and that the geography there is important because of social standing. Those kind of connections are in part their socioeconomic positions, but also suffrage organizing takes women living close to each other. And so rural Kentucky, it's much harder for women to organize because you're not around the corner from others. You have to have that concentration often to really get momentum going.
I found in looking at some of the research that has emerged that my great aunt, who kind of, I think, was first the spark in Frankfurt, she enlisted about 6 different cousins to come to that early meeting in 1902. And that was in my great grandfather's house on Washington.
Yeah, that's exciting. Well, I'm sure you can find newspaper clippings like that would help tell the story. I think I was pretty naive. I kept thinking that people probably had stuff squirreled away in their attics, and with the Centennial approaching, we would find all these new materials and interesting sources, and they just haven't really appeared. So that leaves Laura Clay's papers at UK are the easiest and most thorough recounting of the movement. But Laura Clay had her own investment in telling the story in a way that would make her look good and would pitch it from her perspective. And so that was a challenge as a historian to go in there and read those sources, but always with a critical eye and think, okay, well, what didn't she save? Where can I find corroborating information. And so I still have hopes that people will have something tucked away and, passed down from grandma, because it just seems like everyone knew that this was a historical moment when it was happening. And not everything that has happened in the past do we know that at the time. It's only in looking back. The recent pandemic, we have known we're living through historic times right now. And I think women's suffrage was similar to that. So I'm surprised that people there isn't more of these treasure troves of materials. So be on the lookout for them, though, and let me know if you find them.
Yeah.
I think it's amazing to me to think it was between 70 and 80 years, and the courage that these women had.
Yeah, and the ones that started it didn't see it.
Right.
Fulfillment, and in Kentucky's story, we have women like that. Susan Look Avery, who's a remarkable woman from Louisville, who her husband dies. She's in her 70s, in her 80s. She's suddenly coming to life as a suffrage organizer, and a bunch of other causes too. And just really, she's pretty bold and unexpected in the way she's lining up, and she doesn't get to see it. She dies before she ever gets the vote. So a lot of investment that we all today still benefit from.
So is the ratification vote close in Kentucky when the legislators vote, or is it overwhelmingly in favor? Or
it is, I would say, overwhelmingly in favor. You have a few holdouts who were really committed to trying to hold it up, but Madeline Mcdowell Breckenridge goes for first day consideration in the legislature. Usually the legislature, when the session opened, they were voting for committee chairs and organizing and doing the business, getting things just underway. She pushes for a first day passage. They consider the amendment in the House. It immediately passes because they wanted to set a record. By that point, enough states had ratified. We weren't going to be the first or anything like that, but we could be the quickest to get this in the bag. But the Senate holds things up, and so it takes a couple hours in the Senate. And actually, trying to think, is it Maine? There's another state that ratifies the same day we did, and they beat us by a couple of minutes. So we're the 24th state instead of the 23rd state. But it by the time it's being considered in the legislature, although Laura Clay is doing everything she can to still get it defeated, it's basically a foregone conclusion. The governor, Morrow, was for it. He addresses the legislature. It was the first time ever he gave an oral, in-person speech to the legislature. He urges them to pass it, and they do.
I have a question. I was wondering if you could speak more about the women of color and what was happening in their communities when they were organizing, or perhaps it's in your book. I'm embarrassed I haven't read it yet, but I intend to. Can you speak about the women of color?
Yeah, I've actually been doing some more research on that topic, sort of extending what's in the book, and then also thinking about what happens after 1920. As Black women now have this right to vote, because Kentucky is different. Let me just say that throughout the South, and I showed the numbers, like 3% of African Americans are registered to vote in the South in 1940. But Kentucky is a little different, and Kentucky never officially disfranchised African-American, first males and then later women, they are voting and they're organizing, they're forming Republican clubs that they overwhelmingly are supporting the Republican Party, but women are lining up to use that right to vote. Before though 1920, Black women are very much club women. They're forming religious organizations, educational organizations. When the General Federation of Women's Clubs, which was a white organization, they specifically banned Black clubs from affiliating. Black women form the National Association of Colored Women. And here in Kentucky, we have a chapter. Now, one thing is a lot of the source material has not been preserved. So finding some of their newsletters, newspaper coverage, it's very hard to come by. I did find one instance that was published in the Lexington newspaper of Black women at their state convention, a speech that is calling for the vote, but they're calling for improved schools for their children. They're, like I said, trying to make sure that they can ride on first class cars of the trains. They had been pushed to smoking cars. Lynching, a big issue, orphans, trying to care for orphans. So a variety of causes that were more immediate.
Mhm. And did Mary Ellen Britton write? Do we have anything from her?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and some of her, she went by the pen name Meb, M-E-B were her initials, and she was a frequent correspondent in Black publications, and she's pretty bold. She doesn't often speak about suffrage, but she's speaking about a whole variety of other issues. But she does give that first suffrage speech, and we have the text of that, and it's been transcribed and you can find it, I'm sure, very easily. But she uses a lot of biblical examples and she pulls no punches. Women should vote.
Is she a Frankfurt woman?
She is a Lexington woman.
Mhm.
Her sister was also very politically active, but she's in Tennessee, I think.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes it makes me feel a little, I don't know, intimidated by the things these women are doing and the way they're willing to go against the grain, especially Black women. Any other questions?
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Goan. This is fantastic. I know I've learned a tremendous amount from you here tonight, and I just think it's so fascinating. Nash, you were talking about it all being kind of in just a few block radius, and it's so neat, being in the library building that's there on the corner of, Wapping and Washington, and thinking about all the things that were taking place. And you're standing right there in that spot and you're working right there in that spot every day. It's just such a neat feeling, and I feel lucky to be able to be there. Just looking back, and just thank you so much. I appreciate everyone being here tonight. Thank you to Dr. Goan. And let's see, we got some comments here. And everybody's saying thank you. Before we end out tonight, though, I don't know, is Sylvia still with us? Sylvia, are you here? I think you might be muted. Or if somebody else from the committee is on and would want to give just a quick plug for the events on the 21st. If you could want to just share with everyone where maybe they could find some more information if they're interested in participating in either the march or any of the events that day. Is there a website or?
I think there is a website. I don't know I don't know the link exactly, but we are going to be open too during that day, Liberty Hall. So 12 to 2 will be open. Anyone can come in for free. And I'm also doing, it's kind of a little outdoor exhibit of the women associated with Liberty Hall. So that'll be there too.
Let me see if I can look it up really fast.
Yeah, I know it has a website for sure.
I'm pretty sure it does.
And I think March is what, at 11?
Yes.
Yeah, 11. Yeah.
I think, or there's cemetery tours too, because I know.
I think the day is starting out with the cemetery tours.
I think that's right. Yeah.
I know Patty Peevler and Russ Hatter. I'm not sure if Sylvia's going to be up there too, but they're going to start the day off with a cemetery tours. I'm so sorry. I thought she was going to be here. I would have looked this up earlier, but let me look it up really fast. And because I want everybody to know about it in case you're interested in taking part. I got a chance to look at the schedule earlier in the week, and it looks like it's going to be fantastic. Well, I can't find it. Of course, when you have pressure on you, you can't find it. It is on August 21st, starting at 11 o'clock. And you know what? If there is a website, I will find that and I will send it out to everyone in an email. So you'll have that information if you would like to join in next weekend. But I will shoot that out in an email to everyone tomorrow morning once I get into the office again. But thank you all again. Yes, ma'am.
Oh, I just found it.
You found it. Oh, thank you,
I'll put it in
Kate.
the chat here.
Thank you so much. I know that those folks have put in so much work and honestly years of planning leading up to the Centennial, and then with everything that happened last year, I just really hope that they get a good turnout and a lot of support for a really wonderful event. Okay, Kate shared it in the chat. So if you're interested, you can grab that and hope that you'll be able to participate if you're interested there. But okay, well, thank you again for joining us. Thank you to Dr. Goan. We do have her book in the library. So if you're interested in taking a look at that, I believe we have both of her books. So if you're interested in reading more, do that. Do check those out. Come and visit us. I know next week leading up to the celebration, we'll have a special display on women's suffrage. So come check out some of those titles, and we would love to see you. So this recording, of course, I mentioned earlier, will be available probably next week. It'll be up on our YouTube page, the PSPL YouTube page. So if you enjoy the presentation and would just like to watch again, or if one of your family members or friends, if you'd like to share it with them, we would love for you to pass that information along, and would love for them to go and check it out. So thank you all again for being here. I hope you have a wonderful evening, and hope to see you at another program with the Paul Sawyer Public Library very soon. Have a wonderful night.
Thanks so much.
Bye, Melanie. Thank you.
Thank you.